On this Shabbat Zachor, as we will be highlighting some of the themes as Rabbi Kling-Perkins thoughtfully introduced them to us, I first want to pause and just thank the members of our Glatzer planning team, Judy Cantor, Francine Jacobs, Susan Cook, Terry Schwartz-Russell, and Sandy Goldstein. When we sat down to start thinking about Glatzer this year, we really expanded the vision. And instead of just having one special Shabbat, we've had a number of special Shabbatot and Motzei Shabbat. And it's been a real gift to have Dr. Melila Eshel Eshed come to our community in January and do some teaching in a number of different fields, Hebrew literature, Zohar, Midrash, and text. And then to have Rabbi Jeff Summit present in his fields of expertise in music. And now we wanted to focus on something that is unfortunately a topic of concern. If you would have asked me 5, 10, 15 years ago where we would be on a topic such as anti-Semitism, I don't think I would have listed it in the top 5 or even top 10 issues concerning the Jewish people. And sadly, that is no longer the case. It is a real issue for us, and it is something that is present for us. I wanted to frame it in a way connected to the Parsha as I introduce our wonderful speaker this Shabbat, which is that I find this maftir, which is connected to my bar mitzvah portion, Parshat Ki Tetzei, and the Haftarah to be problematic and troubling. They say, wipe out Amalek. And I think we need a little bit of reinterpretation. We really don't wish to wipe out our enemies. And we're not, at least I'm certainly not, and I assume that most of you are not in favor of vilifying our enemies. I think what we want to do is be aware of what those who would malign us and do us harm are doing. We certainly want to protect ourselves. And ultimately, we hope, as our tradition hopes on the Yamim Noraim, that they have a change of heart, that they are open to new ways of thinking, and that they perform tshuva and turn from their ways of understanding. There's lots of misinformation in our world and ways of manipulating people. And we see how people can go down rabbit holes of hatred very easily in the internet and be all of a sudden thinking that there are space lasers running by the Rothschilds attacking humanity and all kinds of bizarre things that people believe. These are frightening. So this Shabbat, we've invited a very special guest who's also not a guest. Dr. Rachel Fish is the founding executive director of the Foundation to Combat Anti-Semitism. This foundation was established to catalyze dynamic new solutions to stop the age-old hatred advanced by those who seek the elimination of Judaism and the Jewish people and the modern movement to destroy the world's only Jewish state. The foundation focuses on positively impacting attitudes of young people around the world, leveraging social media to deliver educational campaigns and spur action by people of all backgrounds. And you can see it on their wonderful website. Rachel was also most recently the senior advisor and resident scholar of Jewish Israel philanthropy at the Paul Singer Foundation in New York City. Dr. Fish has worked closely with grantees to support them and provided framing around their educational content and programming. She's aided in developing strategy for the Foundation's Jewish and Israel philanthropy. And before that, she was executive director here locally of the Schusterman Center for Israel Studies at Brandeis University. She helped train the next generation of academics in the field of Jewish studies, which many of us know her from. And I've heard her amazing presentations on Israel to many different groups. She has completed her doctoral degree in Near Eastern and Judaic Studies at Brandeis. Her dissertation, Configurations of Binationalism, the Transformation of Binationalism in Palestine, Israel, from the 1920s to the present, examines the history of the idea of binationalism and alternative visions for constructing the state of Israel. She's taught locally at Brandeis, the University of Massachusetts in Amherst, and locally at Harvard, and in many, many adult education programs. In 2015, she held the Rohr Visiting Professorship at Harvard, where she lectured on modern Israel and received the Derek Bach Certificate in Teaching Excellence, which I can tell you from hearing her teach is well deserved. She is co-editor with Ilan Troen of the book Essential Israel, Essays for the 21st Century. In her volunteer capacity, in case that's not enough, she is the president of JCDS, the Jewish Community Day School, and she's a proud member of Temple Emunah with her husband, Dave Cutler, with their children. I see Ezra's right there with her, Ashi, Nadav, and Amital. And it is a pleasure to have you in our community and to hear from you this Shabbat morning. Brucha haba. Welcome, Rachel.
Thank you so much, Rabbi Lerner, and thank you to the Glatzer Memorial program for inviting me to participate. I am greatly appreciative. So I was tasked with speaking about anti-Semitism within 15 to 20 minutes. And as you all know, these are large subjects that fill volumes of books and can be taught over semesters worth of periods of time. So what I thought I'd do is actually just really lay the groundwork for us to think about the different permutations and mutations in the way in which Jew hatred has transformed from the times that we see of what we read today, this idea of hatred towards Jews because of their specific religious practices and religious identity, to looking at how that has been understood within a Christian context, within the context of Islam, then how it has been racialized as we understand it from a European context, and then today how we see it playing out and the unique aspects that we see particularly in the American setting as well. So that's what we're going to try to do in a very short period of time. So let's begin with this period of what we read. What we read and what we see in the period of the biblical time, and then later when we see it also in terms of what we're going to read with Megillat Esther and Haman being a descendant of Amalek, is this idea that the Jews are distinct, but they are distinct because of their religious affiliation, their religious practices, their religious identity. And when you see this taking place during the periods of our text, what we find is that we don't, as a community, have an answer to respond to it. There's a sense that God tells the Jews how to behave. There are certain commandments about how you engage with or marginalize that particular group, that tribe, that identity. There are acts of individuals who display some courage, like we see in Esther, who are willing to actually speak some truth to power in that context, to be able to say, wait, hold on, what's happening here and what should we do? And how do we then, again, push this individual aside so that our community is not harmed? During the period of the rise of Christianity, however, we begin to see a change in the way in which Jews have to engage with this form of what I would say Judeophobia, a fear of Jewishness, whatever that means in the broadest sense. And what we see within Christianity, which is different than what we are seeing in some of these earlier texts, is that now there is a theological framing. And that theological framing within Christianity suggests that the covenant that the Jews have with God has been replaced. And that replacement of the covenant now says that there's a new Israel, and that new Israel is with Christians. And as a Christian community, there are theological underpinnings that suggest that the Jews are no longer needed in the same way that they were once needed. And you have this concept of supersessionism, the idea that now God has rejected the original people, the Jews, the Hebrews, and has replaced the Torah. No longer are the mitzvot so important, but rather it's this idea that the Jews have sinned, that they are born in a way in which they cannot overcome that sin unless they accept this new Messiah, the Messiah of Jesus, which obviously the Jews do not accept for the most part. So therefore, you have this framework within the early formation of Christianity that creates a tension because the theological underpinnings are now something that the rabbis have to contest with. And you begin to have polemical and I'd say polemical debates within the church. in which the rabbis are put on trial, a pseudo trial in most cases, but they have to defend the writings in our tradition. And it's in counter to what the church fathers are articulating as the new position. And the church fathers hold enormous authority, not just religiously, but also in terms of policy, in terms of the way in which the state is going to engage in thinking about what its relationship ought to be with a community that is not part of the majority. This is when you begin to see the melding of church and state, because the Holy Roman Empire is truly holy, and it is holy according to a particular context, a context of the church's understanding of what holiness means. The other piece of this within Christianity is that those church fathers begin to use violent language, and that violent language is taken not just by the king, but also the masses. And if you think about medieval Christian Europe, for example, this is when you begin to see that those kinds of writings by church fathers are leveraged by the people in order to be able to mobilize a mob of individuals to foment their anger and hostility towards. This is when you begin, for example, to see the emergence of the blood libel. The idea that Jews use the blood of non-Jews, of Christians, for their specific baking of, matzot. This idea, which gains great momentum. It does not stay only within a Christian context. It is adapted into Islam as well, once Islam comes into being. And it crosses borders, meaning this is not specific to one particular territory, but it's an idea that has the capacity to create a trope, one of the early anti-Semitic tropes, that Jews contaminate societies in a variety of ways, such as think about the bubonic plague, how Jews are being seen as the ones who are not impacted by the bubonic plague, which is not the case. Take that to today. There are many tropes around Jews, Israel, and the COVID vaccine. And that is consistent from the period of this early medieval time. The other piece of this that we have to just at least mention in terms of Jews and Christianity is that it takes a very long time for the church to actively dissociate from the ideas that were put forth by the church fathers, such as Jews killed Jesus. And it's not until the period after the Second Vatican that you begin to see the church begin to actually do some tshuva around this, and recognizing that this has perpetuated sentiments of hostility and has cultivated fear for the Jewish community, and use that fear for the purpose of political ideas in order to gain momentum across Europe, which of course, in many ways, the penultimate of that was during the Holocaust. Now, if you look at what happened in Christianity, it also has to be looked at what happens within Islam. And Islam, it's a bit more challenging to talk about theologically because you have the notion of Dar al-Kitab, the people of the book. So Jews have a special relationship with Islam, similar to Christians, because we come from a similar origin and the Abrahamic traditions. At the same time, there are specific tenets within Islam that highlight the differences between the Jewish community and the dominant Muslim community, where Jews were living in the Arab world, the Near East. And what two of those particularly are dhimmi and dhimmi status, the idea that Jews are second-class citizens. Jews, for example, could not ride horses and be the same height as Muslims. They had to ride donkeys. Jews had to wear an identifying Star of David way before the period of the Nazis to show who they were. They were Jews. If you spend time in Spain, for example, and you want to go visit a synagogue, you notice that in order to enter the synagogue, you go down because the synagogue cannot be as tall as the mosque. So these were some of the practices that were part of the culture and the religion. Jews also had to pay a separate tax, the jizya. So did Christians. So there are some of these theological underpinnings. And of course, if you read certain Quranic texts, the way you can read any religious text, you will find that there are specific elements within some of those surahs, some of those chapters and those passages that highlight hatred or animosity towards the Jews. The way we read about Amalek. That doesn't necessarily mean those are inherent aspects of the tradition, but it does mean that Muslim religious leaders need to grapple with that in order to help understand and make sense of it in a current moment in time. Now, where it becomes more complicated for Islam is actually within the concept of Dar al-Harb and Dar al-Islam. These are the political theological framings of Islam, which says that anywhere where Islam reigns supreme, Dar al-Islam, you cannot have an infidel living in your midst who has authority. So here's where you have a problem. What happens when you have a place like Israel, which is clearly part of a world that used to be Dar al-Islam and now is considered Dar al-Harb? Think about the ISIS-ISIL mentality here, those extreme positions, but it's not so extreme when Hamas, and if you read the Hamas covenant, uses the language of Dar al-Harb and Dar al-Islam to talk about this relationship between Jews, Judaism, and the political collective identity of Jews and the nation state of Israel. So there's one of the challenges. Now let's fast forward to Europe during the period of the 19th century. During the period of the 19th century, you have an emergence of nationalism sweeping across Europe. The idea that there are particular organic identities connected to land, soil, and blood. You can read it in almost any nation state that's emerging at the time in Europe, but particularly you can read it in Germany. And you can understand, and even if you read some of the Jewish philosophers like Rabbi Martin Buber, who talks about this connection between land and soil and blood. But what happens is that in the German context specifically, that idea is heightened to a place in which it's going to become about policy toward those individuals who may not be considered, quote unquote, indigenous to this particular territory. Now, the challenge we see with this sort of racialization of anti-Semitism, and the phrase anti-Semitism is coined during this period by Wilhelm Marr in 1897. The individual says, there are these people, right, Jews, and if we don't like them, then here's the term, anti-Semitism, because Jews are Semites, they're the other, they are Eastern, they are Oriental in nature. They don't belong to this place, Germany. They are inherently different than us. They don't look like us. And here's the thing. They cannot just convert out of their Christianity because these traits are immutable. It is inherent in their DNA. And if it is inherent in your DNA, conversion is no longer an option, because converting from Judaism to Christianity doesn't solve for the identity problem that your DNA is not like an Aryan's DNA. So this is where the concept of anti-Semitism is coming from. And here we begin to see even more so these kinds of ideas of the racialization of anti-Semitism becoming part of the policy in which the state is clearly articulating a position against the Jewish community. So you begin to see, and you saw this even during that period of the 18th century with pogroms, persecution of particular communities, where it was top-down sanctioned by the ruler of a territory, targeting the specific population, using the army as one of the tools, as well as employing fear to mobilize the masses. So now we don't like Jews because of their religion. And now Jews can't even change because of their religion. And so we don't like them because of their ethnic composition. And all the more so, these Jews are pesky. These Jews are pesky because they're not only staying true to who their Jewish identity is, even if they acculturate, but they're succeeding. They actually are helping create a culture. They are influencing the arts. They are building literature. They are having an impact on our thinking, and they are contributing to our society in which we are beginning, i.e., Germans and other Europeans, may incorporate some of these ideas. And socialism must be an invention of the Jews. And so therefore, we have to be even more wary of these people. And then you begin to see the discriminatory practices that come out not only from the Nazis, but other fascist entities. And you begin to see that process of anti-Semitism as many of us understand it and know it today. But it doesn't stop there. This is actually where I would say most educators feel most comfortable talking about Jew hatred or hatred of Jews and the concept from Christianity, the emergence of Christianity, to this period of this racialization during the Holocaust. But now we have to talk about anti-Semitism during a contemporary period. So what does it mean to actually have a hatred toward the Jews for their collective identity and the ability of those Jews to have a collective nation state? And this is a conversation that you absolutely see playing out in European universities, European media, and specifically in America, higher education, and I would say progressive, harder left political positions. And you begin to see that the discussion around anti-Zionism merges into a discussion of anti-Semitism. Now, I have to say very clearly two things here. First of all, I'm not talking about criticism of Israeli policy. We all do it. Every Israeli I know does it, whether they live in Tekoa and Efrat, or if they live in Tel Aviv or Haifa. So criticism of Israeli policy, the current government, whatever it may be, always kosher. People may not like it, but it's kosher. What we're talking about is the clear demonization, dehumanization, and a double standard that says Israel has no right to exist. And that's the starting point. And when that is the starting point, it's very, very challenging for many, especially younger Jews, to feel that they can navigate that conversation. There are often faculty who impose that position. There are outside organizations who come onto campus who align themselves with a progressive agenda, many of which you all, my family included, care about. Ideas around women, feminism, race, anti-racist positions, making sure that the individuals in the LGBTQ population feel safe and cared for and included. And yet, there is a litmus test around the progressive agenda. And part of that litmus test is, do you think that Israel has no right to exist? And that is where it becomes extremely difficult to engage in conversations, particularly with individuals with whom we want to build allyship and community bridges between. The other piece of this is what we saw January 6th. It is not new. It is part of the fabric of American history. We have seen it since the period before the Jim Crow laws. All the more so, we have seen it with political individuals, and we now have seen it in which we saw Confederate flags, swastikas being raised in the name of a particular political party. This is white supremacy. And the white supremacy that is native to this country, which is a bit different than the context of the racialization that we were talking about in Europe of anti-Semitism, that white supremacy does not recognize Jews as being white. Jews are the other. They forever will be the other, not just because of their religion, but because of their identity as well. Now, their cultural identity. So white supremacists don't like Jews because we can never be purely white. We are not going to be recognized as being part of the native population, which you all recognize the irony here because none of us were native to this territory. And then on the hard left, what you find is that you are seen as having white privilege, and there lacks a conversation around the complexity of what it means to have a Jewish identity that may not always be understood as not having white privilege. So Jews are truly caught in the crosshairs between the right, the left, and the political discussion. Religiously, there are claims against Jews. And then because of the collective identity for self-determination and Jews holding real power, the power to make decisions, and an intellectual underpinning that challenges that trope around Orientalism, imperialism, and universalism, which all are important ideas, but when taken and hijacked for a political purpose to suggest that Jews don't have the ability to organize as a nation state, it poses a very clear action where the collective identity of Jews is put forth as a primary agenda. So I think I'm right at 20 minutes and hit all of those pieces. And I think we're going to have a conversation after services.
Wow. Yasher Koch. As all your presentations, you articulated it, you set it out for us, you gave it structure. And I think all of us now have a deeper understanding of how to put it in some categories. It's not like it's all great news. It's not, but at least we can see the progression in such a clear way. And we thank you for that. Right after services, we're going to invite everyone to grab some food for Kiddush, and we're going to deepen the conversation with Rachel, with Dr. Fish, with some Q&A. And I think that's where we're really going to have the opportunity to dig in deeper. And I know many of you are going to be really interested and fascinated by that. So let's start it off. And I'm going to look around for hands. I see a few people have already raised their hand. You can feel free to raise your hand physically or the Zoom way if you'd like to. We're going to start with Mike Gildesgame, and then we'll head over to Fred. But please make it a question, and not a lengthy comment, so that we can hear from Rachel, from Dr.
Yeah.
Fish. Okay, Michael.
Thank you, Rabbi. Thank you, Rachel Fish, for that wonderful presentation. Just briefly, was reading Simon Schama's Story of the Jews, Volume 2, and it goes into great detail about the anti-Semitism in France. I mean, you spoke clearly about Germany, but it's not just Germany. It seems that France has a long history of anti-Semitism, and I wondered if you might comment on how that came about and how important that is in the bigger picture.
It's a great question. First, I just want to say thank you, all of you, for listening and actually paying attention. Even Ezra looked at me and goes, I understood most of that. So I knew I was, at least pretty clear. So thank you. And it really is an honor to be part of the conversation. Mike, you're absolutely right. It is definitely not just Germany. And the conversation with France, so much of it is because of the influence of the Catholic Church, so much of it. And that's where it stems from. I obviously can't go into each country in a class. I would do that. But what I would say is that the history and the legacy of the Catholic Church is enormous within France. The other piece is that within France, you have this idea of your Frenchness being your outward identity, and it means your religious identity has to be sublimated, or the idea of having it private, right? The idea that you don't wear religious clothing, religious garb, religious identifiers, whether it's a cross on your neck, a kippah, a Magen David, and the hijab. And if you think about even just the history in the last several months and years in France, that keeps coming up and has become more pronounced within the public discourse in France, particularly as you have had an increase of immigrants coming from Muslim countries, mostly from Syria, but not only. And individuals who are coming from those places who have not practiced democracy and have not been in democratic nation states and have more, I'd say, at times, radicalized forms of religion. Not all, obviously, one has to be careful here, but the ideas of egalite, liberté, and fraternité are supposed to reign supreme in France. And the Catholic Church, of course, had an undertone for, decades, really generations, around a real distrust, dislike, and to some degree, disdain for Jewish identity as a religion. And then, of course, once you come to the period of the 1920s, 1930s, 1940s, it's also having to struggle with the realities and factors of fascism. So all of these things also impact the conversation in France.
Thank you for that question, Mike, and Rachel for the
may I jump in just because I'm French on this?
Add 1 second on before you jump in. I just want to
Okay, so I cannot. Okay.
No, you can jump in, and we'll let you jump in ahead of the other people.
Very briefly.
One second.
What rate?
1 second.
Okay.
I just wanted to comment that last night I was going through my father's papers and reading his bulletin articles from the 1970s, and it was fascinating to see France's position against Israel in the early 1970s, very clearly staking a strong position against it. And I was reading my father's articles, even asking for a boycott of French products, French travel to France, and French wines. And it was fascinating to read his bulletin article on Bevakasha.
Yeah. No, what I'm saying is there are actually there are movements that come from different directions and they're conflicting because actually the laïcité, the French laïcité was primarily against the church, actually, against the influence of the church. So it's also what allowed the Jews to thrive in France. So we have to be very careful in criticizing the fact that you're not showing your religion, because that's also what helped curb the influence of Christian anti-Semitism in France. It's because of this laïcité, French laïcité, that the Jews were not targeted. And I also have to say that today in France, this Christian anti-Semitism still exists. It's there. It's not what makes the Jews leave primarily. What makes Jews leave primarily is more of a Muslim anti-Semitism that comes both from those roots that Rachel has described, this kind of belief that the Jews should be somehow inferior, and the fact that Jews are doing very well in the French as immigrants, very well in the French society, and it creates some jealousy too. So it's a mix of everything, and I would end with the fact that exactly like in Germany, the French anti-Semitism at the end of the 19th century was a mixture of Christian anti-Semitism and a more nationalistic, racial anti-Semitism and jealousy on the fact that Jews had been recently emancipated and successed tremendously in the French society. So that's it.
Thank you, Rachel.
No, that's just very helpful. And I totally agree with all of that. And I appreciate the push to disentangle it all. And I also think, as you're saying, Rabbi Lerner, France has a very complicated history with Israel, right? It's France who gives the ability for Israel to have some of its warplanes as the first nation state to give it to Israel. It's France who says quietly, we're going to have this tripart agreement in order for Israel to sort of be ready to go against Egypt. And we're going to be behind the scenes providing some cover. And that becomes more and more complicated by the period of the 60s for sure, after the experience of the 6-Day War, and for sure even to this day.
Fascinating. All right, let's turn it over to Fred and then Ethan. Fred, go ahead.
Hello, Rachel. I was very, very impressed with your talk indeed. I have two comments. As people know in my community, I like words. The word Semite, I just looked. It comes from the word Shem. And unfortunately, the Muslims are Semite. So when we say anti-Semite, we're saying, something anti-Jews, I don't know what. I come from Baghdad, and I never really understood anti-Semite the way it is in Europe. My next comment is that the biggest atrocities against Jews as such after the Holocaust is the wiping off of all Judaic Jews in Arab countries. And very little, unfortunately, the American Jewish community do not stress the fact that I don't know how many Jews were really stripped of their nationality, of their money, and hanged, and we don't get much representation. There is some communities now in Montreal that are emphasizing this. So I'd like your comment, Rachel.
So thank you. I definitely appreciate the question, Fred. the term Semite is actually a term that's used specifically. Yes, its origins are Shem, but the term is used in the context that I'm using it as a category to delineate geographical and linguistic similarities. So what do I mean by that? With the Hebrew and Aramaic and Arabic, those are Semitic languages, and Semitic languages are coming from the territory of what we would consider the area of the greater Mediterranean, Near Eastern area. And that as a category was used later to then delineate people from that territory. There aren't really Semitic people, though. It wasn't used for that purpose in its origin, but it was applied to people coming from that territory. Now, in a European context, when you start to read some of the early literature written by individuals who are themselves haters of Jews, they start to use the term to call Jews, not Jews, but Semites, because it starts to give this racial, ethnic composition to a people that extends beyond a religion. So when you are reading some of the early European literature, what you will find is that Jews, not Muslims, specifically in Europe, are referred to as a Semitic people, or the people of the East, the Easterners, or the Orientals. And it's always in reference to Jews. It is not in reference to Muslims or Arabs. That then is taken as a term by someone like Wilhelm Marr in 1897, and he says, great, the Easterners are the Jews, so I'm going to label this term anti-Semitism. It's a pseudoscientific term because, remember, this whole process of eugenics, this idea of the racialization of science, it's not actually legitimate science. But at that time, in the period of the 19th century, it is trying to portray itself as a legitimate science. And so that is the context in which this term anti-Semitism then emerges. I personally find it very problematic. I find it problematic because of the reason you're saying, because you can say, and the claim now is made, that Muslims, Arabs also are a Semitic people, knowing that they come from this area. They have a language that has roots, right? Literally, our Shorashim are the same, right? We can take the words and figure out the different roots of those words, from shalom to salam, whatever it may be. So here the challenge is that, let's say you're talking to, and I'm going to make a categorization, and I want to be clear, I don't like to do that. But let's say you're talking to an Arab who has a very negative / anti-Israel perspective. And they'll say, well, I can't be anti-Semitic because I'm a Semite. That's part of the challenge, because the categorization can be used for the purpose to be able to cleanse themselves of being labeled as someone who hates Jews or doesn't like Jews. I also am a big believer that we shouldn't be using terms created by the individuals who hate us. And because I find with my work today, as I'm working with younger and younger communities, not all Jews, non-Jews and Jews, let me give you an example. When I say, what is an anti-Semite? What is anti-Semitism? Here's what they say to me. Most of them say IDK. I don't know. They can't even take the time to spell it, right? So then if you actually get them to try, they'll say, well, I'm an anti-racist. I'm anti-homophobia. I'm anti-Islamophobia. So I must be an anti-Semite. And you realize you want to say to them, no, you're an anti-Semite, you hope, but they don't understand the language. And we can laugh, but they really don't get it. So I prefer to use the term hatred of Jews or Jew hatred. I will tell you that I have found pushback, especially from an older generation of Jews who do not like the terms Jew hatred or hatred of Jews, because they said to me, it feels very crass. And my answer to that is good. It should feel very crass. This is a very bad thing. And so I actually want to label it for what it is. Now, in terms of the question around Mizrahi and Jews coming from the Arab world, coming from Iran, you are absolutely right to note that there was a huge exile, some of it forced for sure, much of it politically forced upon Jews who were living in the Eastern Arab world and in Iran. And I think, in the American Jewish context, too often Obviously, there are some exceptions in certain geographical regions, whether it's LA, Long Island, some other places as well. The American Jewish community does not understand Mizrahi Sephardi identity and is pretty, Ashka normative in terms of its approach to looking at Jewish history and the Jewish experience. And so there has to be a much more intentional discussion about the heterogeneity of the Jewish communities, and understand that Jews coming from the Arab world and from Iran, from Northern Africa, the Maghreb, right, and the East, that there is an entire history that is not the same as the European Jewish experience. And much of that conversation also has to then go into the Israel conversation. There are a couple of books, obviously, that have been written about this. There is a good film called The Forgotten Refugees about Jews from the Arab world. It was made a while ago now, but it's pretty good. And we have to educate, obviously, much more about the pogroms, right? The Farhud that happened in Iraq, that our population, for the most part, is not as fluent in understanding. So I agree with you. It has to be a bigger part of the discussion.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. We have done a little bit of work with that, and we have shown some films and had some speakers about those Jews, about 700,000, who obviously make up a big group. I'm going to try to get to everyone. So we're going to go over to Ethan, and then Miriam Sadovsky, and then Fred, and I saw some other hands, but we will make our way around to everyone. So go ahead. First, Ethan.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Rachel, for a really interesting talk. I'm asking if you might speak a little more about one of the topics you raised, which is people on the left in the United States, and particularly academics, and I am an academic, who tend to have an anti-Israel bias that again gets conflated into some form of anti-Semitism. It's something I'm thinking about a lot because I currently serve on the board of an academic organization, the Association for Asian Studies, and I and several other new board members have been really pushing that organization to make more and more political statements. So, we condemned China's actions in Hong Kong, and we condemned the coup or the military takeover in Myanmar. And we, had pretty strong statement in support of Black Lives Matter last year. And now, as I'm listening to your presentation, I'm thinking, does this mean in the near future, these same people I think of as my friends on the board are now perhaps going to want to make a statement on Israel in some way? That's never come up so far. So this is just in my mind, but it has me worried. And I'm wondering what thoughts you have on how one deals with this, or where this is headed, or something like that.
Ethan, it's a very good question, and I really do empathize because I know how politicized the academy is, and many of the academic associations. And I don't want to worry you, but I also feel like you should be very worried. And I'm actually very serious because it doesn't take much to get from what the places you just said that have been condemned, or public statements that are made by an academic association, to start to condemn Israel. And I'm actually surprised it hasn't happened thus far, because other academic associations like the American Studies Association, the psychology, the political science, a couple of others have tried over the last, I'd say decade, to front and center put the conversation about Israel. And even if they didn't specifically talk about boycott, divestment, and sanctions, they are backdooring that conversation in a serious way. And some of the language, and I don't know what your discipline you're in, but some of the language that is used is language that's being pulled from the humanities for that purpose. And again, as you know, and not to speak in generalizations, anything I say right now, each of these can be shown both the contours of them, imperialism, right? Whether it's universalism, ideas of colonialism. We feel steeped as academics to talk about those in its different formulations. But what happens in the conversation around Israel is that it's pretty simplistic formula. And the simple formula is the following. Israel is a white, imperialist, colonialist entity that has tried to remove the native people of color who are indigenous to the territory, and therefore Israel has no right to exist and ought to be dismantled, and it's anachronistic for it to exist as an ethnic nation state. And it's white Jewish supremacy that ultimately perpetuates its position in the world. Now, I can spend hours debunking all of that. That's often what I have to spend time doing. But what happens by an association is the individuals who, you know, are not necessarily experts in the field of Israel studies, do not have a background to understand Middle Eastern studies, may or may not actually want to go into the depths of understanding Orientalism, and wind up hook, line, and sinker, taking that as a package and then putting that as a political platform for the association. And unfortunately, what happens is faculty then subscribe to it, or there's pushback, depending. And more troubling is that faculty then use that position within their own home institutions to push a political agenda that encourages promoting the BDS movement among student groups, and faculty serve as the resource for those student groups, and then try to encourage the student government to make these claims. No university administration to this day has actually accepted a BDS resolution that has passed at the student government level. Not a single one. However, it doesn't actually matter, because it means that the university and the students at that university are constantly feeling besieged and under attack. They're constantly playing defense. It's like if I said, and this is a terrible example on Shabbat, so excuse me, but if I said to someone, you know, why do you beat your wife? Even if it's not true, the assumption is that that person beats their wife. And that's what happens in the Israel conversation. And what I find is that students do not know how to navigate that conversation. And not only do students not know how to navigate that conversation, many faculty do not know how to navigate that conversation and are terrified of getting involved in it. And they're terrified of getting involved in it because, and this is real, there are personal and professional repercussions. They will not be asked to publish by certain academic presses. They will not be asked to have their papers given at certain conferences. They will not have, you know, a comfortable meeting at the department meeting, and they won't be that comfortable at their, you know, department head's home for a holiday, you know, celebration. And that's very real. And that power dynamic plays out, and it plays out at multiple levels. And part of the challenge is helping students begin to unpack some of these intellectual ideas that seem so vast, and also have a lot to offer in terms of intellectual discourse, but when hijacked for a very clear political purpose, create a very clear agenda against Jews as a collective who desire self-determination.
Well, a lot to think about, and how that impacts our young people, who obviously perhaps even have less defenses than our professors, but a big challenge. All right, I see a bunch of hands raised, so I don't know if it's Miriam or Stuart, but your box has been raised.
Okay. Yep.
You're unmuted, so please unmute.
Sorry. So my question's a little based in history. So, you know, throughout history, I think Jews have been maneuvered into positions that become desirable for general society for us to do. And then anti-Semitism comes in and puts back into our place. So for instance, medieval world, the rise of Jewish bankers, because the Catholic anti-usury laws says that they couldn't loan to each other. So you had this Jew, and then when the loan became uncomfortable, anti-Semitism was a club. So I don't wonder if that's happening again today, and things like, you know, the warming of relations with some countries over Iran, you know, fear of Iran or other things. And I don't know if that's replaying in some ways in terms of grander politics.
It's a very interesting question. And, you know, I'm thinking about your question in relation to some of the Abrahamic Accords. And with those countries, you see a very different discourse starting to take shape geopolitically and strategically. And it's hard to completely disentangle all of it, because the enemy of my enemy is my friend. So, you know, some of these countries recognize that Iran is a very serious threat to them as well. Shiite Islam, they're Sunni, Iran has nuclear capabilities, these countries don't. So it's better to be aligned with Israel. Another piece of this has to do not only with the geopolitics, but the real benefit of being associated with Israel economically and the opportunity economically. And there's also a third piece of this, that these countries say very clearly, it's not about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, right? Like, Israel and the Palestinians need to figure it out, but it shouldn't hold us back anymore, because the Palestinians and the Israelis haven't figured it out. And we don't have a unified approach to Israel. That notion of Arab unity, it's a huge myth. Pan-Arabism didn't work for a reason. Pan-Arabism, just like other forms of pan-nationalism, ultimately said it's what's good for each independent nation state, not just what's good for the conglomerate. So it's a very interesting question, because I don't know if I can completely figure out where anti-Semitism fits into the conversation with Iran on this, but we do know that Iran is still a country that is driven by religion and religio-political framing. And that, of course, will play into this. And yes, it's Shiite Islam, different from Sunni, but Dar al-Harb and Dar al-Islam are still part of that equation. And when you think about Iran and Hezbollah and Hamas, they absolutely have a similar understanding around that political theological framing. So I think there is a piece of it, but I think that it also extends into some of these geostrategic decisions.
Well, for those of you interested, we hope to go to the UAE and experience it firsthand next year. So we'll report back to the congregation. Let's turn it over to Maylee, and then Fred, and then Elizabeth.
Hi, thank you. Thank you so much for a wonderful talk. I have two questions that are kind of related, both from my years living in Germany. So that's the context. One is, I notice, especially during the large influx of refugees from Syria, et cetera, in 2015, 2016, that there was a huge uptick in violence. And what I heard locally was that the Israel-Palestine issue was getting imported into Germany, and I think elsewhere in Europe. And there seemed to be a lack of understanding of the local history, the European framework, and a lack of interest in separating what was happening in Israel and what was happening in Europe. There was also a tension, this totally continues today, between the Turkish minority and the Jewish minority in Germany. The Turkish minority is basically Muslim. It is a much, much larger population. And there's resentment that the German government gives all kinds of support to the Jews and sees the Turks as second-class citizens. There's a whole history behind that, and the German government has made some big mistakes, but I'm interested in your thoughts on that. My second thing is in your talk about language, terminology, I remembered, I realized that in German, they actually have two terms, and I'm curious about your thoughts on this. They say Judenhass, Jew hatred that you're promoting, but they also say Antisemitismus, so exactly anti-Semitism. And I've never thought about this, and I'm wondering if you have thoughts about, is that really the same, or is this somehow different? Thank you.
Yeah, those are great questions. The term Judenhass, Jew hatred, is a term that is coined at a similar time as antisemitismus. They're similar in their origin and their time of origin. And the term Judenhass you often see on paraphernalia when it was being plastered on different, buildings or libraries, benches even, right? So I'm not an expert in that, and I don't want to make any claims about it. I can't tell you, Mealy, if it was used at different times for specific reasons. I also do wonder if this term of anti-Semitism was clearly understood by everyone, whereas again, Judenhass is very clear. It's very clear. Also, the term Juden refers to Jews directly, whereas anti-Semitism, you make assumptions. We know it's targeting Jews, but if you don't have a context for it, you may not understand who it is directed towards. So it is a question that I have that I would not know the answer, and it's worth looking at. And so I thank you for bringing that as a distinction. The issue around politics in Germany and the influx of immigrants coming from the Middle East, and particularly from Syria, where Germany is one of the countries that has taken some of the largest numbers of Syrian immigrants, it's very challenging. And it's challenging because, again, Germany, in many ways, recognizes its history of xenophobia. And because it recognizes its history of xenophobia, is tending to go in a direction in which it wants to be as open as possible and as welcoming as possible to as many as possible who are coming, many of them, from war-torn societies and incredible oppression and dictatorial regimes. And I don't want to diminish that in any shape or form. That being said, at the same time, and it's not just Germany, it's not just France, it's other Western European democracies, it has been very hard to have a public conversation about the sensitivities around Islam, around certain Islamic theological political beliefs, and to just name that not all of these immigrants understand what a democracy means. The fact that you can have, and I know this is not Germany, but just in October, a Muslim man behead a French history teacher because he talked specifically about Muhammad and showed images of Muhammad with the appropriate forewarning that this is controversial, that I'm going to talk about things that may make you uncomfortable, but I'm doing it as a history teacher. And for those of you who really don't want to hear it, you are welcome to leave. And that individual is beheaded while saying Allahu Akbar, not free Palestine. Allahu Akbar, I think, really matters in this conversation. And why it really matters is it means that these European leaders of democracies have to name and struggle in a very public way with these conversations. And they have been reluctant to do so because they don't want to give a perception that they are suggesting that Islam has some practices in it that may not be compatible with democracy. Now, I'm not suggesting that they aren't compatible, but what I am saying is that we have to talk about it. We have to name it, and we actually have to say, where may there be a challenge? Where is there a tension? And what does it mean if that tension exists? And what is the responsibility of the government and of the community of the nation state in order to say, here's what's required to be a citizen in this place. And here are the sensitivities one must understand. And I don't see that conversation happening in a significant, meaningful public way. And therefore, it just creates these atmospheres in which people create more enclaves and silos within the nation state. So there's a new book out by Ayaan Hirsi Ali. Ayaan Hirsi Ali is a Somalian woman. She left Somalia because of the regime that controlled Somalia. And she also is very vocal against the practice of female genital mutilation, which was an active practice that was happening in Somalia towards young women. She then goes to Denmark. She becomes a parliamentarian. Now she actually lives here in America. She also made a film with Theo Van Gogh, criticizing Islam as someone who's from within the religion. I think it was called Submission, and Theo Van Gogh was beheaded because of that film. So Ayaan Hirsi Ali has many books. I recommend reading all of them, but her most recent book is specifically about what's happening, and I think it was France, I'm almost positive, in terms of how Muslim men are creating spaces in which Muslim women may no longer be part of the public space. And this is happening in public spaces in France, in public communities in France, in schools in France. And these women who are coming from these families are being forced to pull back from those spaces and to find a more traditional role for them. This is not part of the French public discourse. And if you are a French citizen, this has to be part of the French. I mean, there is some pushback, there is, but it is not on a policy level. Okay, and saying it is happening at a policy level.
Say a law was just passed about
Yes,
this.
but just now. And Germany is facing it, right? So yes, things are happening, but it's now that it's happening. So my point is that these are building up, and it's been happening now for over a decade. And those spaces in general, or those communities in general, and I will say this is much more in a European context than in the American context, are uncomfortable with the discussion around Islam specifically, because you don't want to be labeled the xenophobe. You don't want to be criticizing and promoting a fear of Islam. And those are very hard things. It's similar to the conversation here on campus around anti-racism. If you start, and I know this community is very involved, as many of us are, in thinking about anti-racist practices. But if you actually try to offer a critical perspective around some critical social theory practice around anti-racism, you will be shunned and labeled a racist just for offering an alternative critical perspective. So if it happens in this country around that discussion, you can imagine all the more so it's happening in a European context around Islam in those countries.
Thank you, Rachel. Let's head over to Fred and then Elizabeth.
So Rachel, you covered an enormous amount of history for us in the 20 minutes that you spoke, and how anti-Semitism really carried through all of that. But my question really starts with the introduction that Rabbi Lerner gave to your talk, that anti-Semitism maybe 10 years ago wasn't even in our top 10 list in terms of concerns, and maybe not even the Holocaust either that far back. And what I wonder is, why now? What's happened around us to where this is such an important and critical issue to us all, to our community? And what I really wonder is that in the last 10 years, that one of the major things that we've seen is the huge outbreak of loss of borders, of immigration, of tens of millions of displaced persons around the world, not just from Europe or from the Middle East, but from Africa and South America and others, all of them labeled as the other and concern for loss of individual identity. Do you think some of that was the spark that led to where we are today?
It's a very good question, Fred. These are huge topics and deserve much more explication than I'm able to give. I would say that the American conversation about anti-Semitism, right? Obviously, it's been on many minds. There are whole organizations like the ADL who were constructed in order for the purpose of ensuring that as much as possible, America would be unique in the conversation about anti-Semitism. But we know that this country, even in its earliest stages, had examples of anti-Semitism, some much more serious than others. But even in the time of the colonies, you saw anti-Semitism, right? If you read Jonathan Sarna's work, you can see where anti-Semitism existed. You see in which individuals who were forming colonies or forming communities who didn't want Jews to be part of those places. Think about Pennsylvania, for example. So that's very real. At the same time, America is unique. It doesn't have the quote unquote baggage of a European history. The Catholic Church was not a founding entity in this country in the way it was in Europe. But you did have individuals who used religion to promote a very clear political agenda against the Jews. Think about Father Coughlin in the 1920s and his radio talks, right, in which he would give his speeches and the way in which he talked about Jews. Think about Jim Crow laws and how they were used. So we do have a history of anti-Semitism, but differently. Now, why wasn't it on the radar, or was it on the radar? I think part of the conversation is that anti-Semitism became conflated with Holocaust education for a very long time in this country. And I don't say that in a value judgment way, but I think there was a sense that if we educated about the Holocaust, we didn't necessarily have to talk about all of these other forms of anti-Semitism, which are part of the story, but they extend beyond the story, beyond the experience, and beyond the history of the Holocaust. And so what we saw were entities and organizations and a real movement, particularly after the Holocaust, to ensure that Americans were educated about the Holocaust. Now, why I say this is because at a certain point, many of those organizations actually said, and it's for a whole slew of factors and reasons, Holocaust education is too particular. Why are we just talking about the Jews and the horrors that they experienced? We should be extrapolating beyond the horrors of that particularism and look at the universal experience. Now, I'm not diminishing that. Of course, you need to know what happens in Rwanda and Somalia and what happens in the, Chechen country, whatever it is. You need to know about other forms of genocide, 1,000%. But each of these genocides need to be in a context of a particular. They don't happen in a universal vacuum. So many of those Holocaust education initiatives pulled away from the particulars of the Holocaust in order to universalize the discussion around genocide. I'll go one step further. Not only did you go to the universalization of genocide, but then you went to, well, let's just talk about what it means to be a bully. Because if you're a bully, then you have the potential to cause or be part of or a cog in the machine of some of these genocides. Now, again, all of us here know how important it is to educate our children so that they understand what it means to not be a bystander, what it means to be an upstander. But history has to have a context. And if you take it out of that context, you lose so much nuance that you actually do a disservice to the conversation. So that's part of this. The other piece is that we found that educators felt very comfortable because they had had Holocaust education. They went to the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum to be educated. They took their teachers and their students on those experiences so that they could understand what was happening. We have facing history in ourselves, right? We go to Yad Vashem to teach our children, all of these things. But what we found was that educators could say, I can tell you what happened in Poland in 1937 or 1942. But what I can't talk about is why right now Jews are getting beat up in Muncie. I don't understand why Jews are getting yelled at the Dyke March in Chicago and being told they can't be part of this movement. And that form of anti-Semitism was beyond the comfort zone for many of the organizations that talked about Holocaust education. Because, why? I'm going to say something that's not politically correct. Because many of those organizations are organizations that feel very comfortable on the left of center of the political spectrum, and they identify with many of the movements which so many of us hold dear on the left of center of the political spectrum, and we're not willing to reflect and call out the forms of anti-Semitism that were brewing. Moreover, they were confused. They thought it was criticism of Israeli policy, and that's not what it was. It was actually very clear targeting of Jews because they are Jews and identify with a collective national group. And because of that, they weren't prepared to be able to engage in that conversation. It's very hard when you're in your own political camp. Same with the right of center, right? If you're right of center, we have seen not enough right of center voices speaking out against what happened at the Capitol. We have seen not enough voices speaking out against anti-Semitism that exists within the own political camp. And it's always easier to be shooting bows across to someone else. But what I will say is that I think now it has become very clear to many, both Jewish organizational leadership, the larger American Jewish community, that Jews clearly are in the crosshairs between the left, between the right, between radical Islamism, and that is never a good place to be. And Jews do not know how to navigate those waters, and Jewish organizational leaders have to be much bolder in calling it out within their own camps and beyond.
tough spot for us. And I think what you just spoke about, you can see that in Facing History and Ourselves, an organization started for Holocaust education. You can see how they broadened, as you just spoke to, a much more universalistic picture. Recently, I was on their website, and now it starts again with the word Holocaust right on their homepage. And you can see how they're a little bit going back and forth in that movement. We've got a bunch of new folks who are just raising their hands. I'm trying to get to everyone. Elizabeth and then Hal.
I actually have a quick comment question to you. In response to Ethan's question about academia, can you say a little bit about the academic engagement network that Mark Udoff is involved with?
Absolutely. So the Academic Engagement Network, Elizabeth, is an umbrella organization for university faculty across the political spectrum, non-Jews and Jews, who really care about academic freedom, deeply value freedom of speech, and at the same time feel as if when the BDS movement calls for a dissociation of Israeli academicians having an exchange of scholarship with academics across America, other countries as well, then there's a problem because it's that double standard. So the Academic Engagement Network was formed as a way to provide two things, really. One, sort of a home for faculty, and Ethan, you should definitely look into it if you don't know it, a home for faculty to begin exploring these issues in a space that allowed for them to be critical and thoughtful and also deeply concerned about what was happening with either in their discipline or their own institutions. It also provided a space for faculty to organize against the BDS movement, not for the purpose of saying that you shouldn't have two states, not for the purpose of saying that Palestinians shouldn't have self-determination, but to say the BDS movement inherently is against academic freedom. And they make that case. The third thing that that AEN has now done is that they're beginning to create some opportunities to educate administrators around the sensitivity of these issues, because often what happens at the university level is that faculty are coming from an ideological or an academic perspective, whereas university administrators have to do two things. One, they aren't necessarily aware and paying attention to the influence of certain funding that's coming from certain parts of the world that actually create a hostile curriculum towards the conversations of Jews, Judaism, and Israel. And this is specifically a problem that exists in some Middle Eastern studies programs. Not all, but some. Meaning, a university can take $20 million from the United Arab Emirates or from Saudi Arabia, and that government official is dictating to a certain degree who the teacher is for certain classes in the university, how it's being taught. Georgetown is a very good example of this. And John Esposito is the one who heads the Georgetown Center for Christian Muslim Understanding, and it's highly problematic towards Jews, Judaism, and Israel. And yet the university does nothing. So it puts the administration more aware of these issues. The second thing is that just as we have sensitivity training in our universities on a variety of subjects, gender identity and sexual orientation, issues around race, issues around other religions, diversity officers have not had sensitivity training around the conversations of Jews, Judaism, and Israel. So AEN is trying to develop some of that material to bring greater awareness, because what happens is the first point of contact are professionals in the administrative office for these students or for the faculty. And very often the university administrators do not understand the discourse on campus, and they say, well, this is just political discourse. Everyone has academic freedom. It's not a big deal. You don't like to hear criticism of Israeli policy. So it's a way to sensitize them to help understand what the real issues are on campus. So AEN is led by Mark Udoff, former chancellor of the University of California system, and he is a First Amendment expert himself. So this is a man who truly believes in the value of the First Amendment, and it's a way to provide faculty a forum to engage in these complex issues.
A lot here. We're going to try to pack in as many questions as we can in the remaining time. Over to Hal.
One of the most galling parts of anti-Semitism is Jewish anti-Semites. Now, is that any different than any other group that has self-hating people?
It's a great question. It goes into a whole psychological discussion, one that, you know, individuals have been thinking about for a very long time. You know, again, without making too broad of generalizations, I think that it, depending upon who the individual is, they come to this particular position, as some would say, like a self-hating Jew, for different reasons. And we have to be careful here not to generalize because of the psychology behind it. But I do think more and more Israel is used as the scapegoat for that conversation, more and more. And I would say that in that perspective, that's where the Jewish community really needs to be doing serious and thoughtful Israel education. Meaning, I know we do this at Temple Emunah, I know we do this at other places, but we cannot just celebrate with falafel and hummus and camels on Yom HaAtzmaut, right? We actually have to talk about the complexities of Israel before children go into these places that can create hostility and where they don't feel that they've been duped. We ask young people to be critical thinkers all the time. We give them multiple perspectives on historical accounts, except when it comes to the Israel discussion, because we're so fearful that if they don't have a positive relationship with this place that feels deeply, you know, connected to them, then, and if we show them the warts around it, then they'll walk away. But we have to have confidence and have the subject matter content expertise to show the nuance and the complexity of these issues, like any society, without being so fearful of that, because that can't drive the ultimate objective and goal. But to your point, Hal, it's very complex. I mean, some is about an internalization of anti-Semitic tropes. Some of it is about internalization of issues within their own understanding of Jewishness. I mean, there are some who will say Philip Roth is a self-hating Jew. You read his books, you see he's struggling with real issues, right? But we have to be careful about how we use the term, but we also have to unpack, you know, what this psychology is at different points in time. But I do think today's conversation is much more about Israel than not.
A lot of food for thought. Let's make it over to, I'm looking for some new folks here, to Ann Lerner. Let's get you unmuted, Ima. Ima, you have to unmute.
One of the things, I've been looking for some positive news on this scene. And having just recently celebrated the 50th anniversary of Nostra Aetate, and we are aware of the big shift in certainly the majority, overwhelming majority of Catholic institutions regarding, you know, everything from Jews killed Jesus on down. And there are many centers for Jewish, Christian, Jewish Catholic relations at universities as well. And so I'm wondering whether this has had a real impact across the board. My late husband converted many people to Judaism, and he would ask them, most of them were Catholics in Northeast, and he would ask them whether they had been told something, taught something in the church about Jews, and basically, most overwhelmingly, they said no, nothing negative. So I'm wondering if this has made any difference in the conversation.
It's a great question, Professor Lapidus Lerner. You were a teacher of mine for one class, so thank you for asking me a question. So I think it's a great point. I really do. I do think that the younger we go, again, do not have as much familiarity at all with this change in the church. I mean, many, not even, you know, in their 40s and 50s, don't understand the church's orientation and the dramatic shift that was brought about in 1965 with Nostra Aetate, right? They don't even know. So I do wonder if it has the same impact. I also question the impact specifically in America, only because the Catholic Church hasn't had as much influence in America. And many of the churches, mainline Protestant churches in particular in America, are again hyper-focused on a sort of a fixation with Israel and not necessarily theology, which is a different part of this conversation. So I do wonder about that. And then interestingly, and you all know this, is that putting the Catholic Church aside for a moment, many of those who are strongly Christian with an expression of that Christianity from evangelical Christianity have very positive views about Israel, while still holding some challenging theological perspectives about Israel. And I don't know, and it's a very good question, Professor Lerner, if this is a conversation that's happening in a meaningful way in the Christian community at all, to talk about these different sort of subsections within each of the churches. And I do think that we can learn quite a bit from the Catholic Church. Kevin Madigan, Professor Madigan, has written quite a bit about this actually. And the tshuva, to use what you said, Rabbi Lerner, of the role of the church and thinking about the way in which the church now engages with Jews and Judaism. But even within the Catholic Church, from my limited understanding, when the Israel conversation pops up, it's a very uncomfortable conversation because there has been, you know, the Paulo Freire pedagogy of the press has become also a part of the religious canon to a certain degree for some of the church, especially in places like, and this goes to Fred's question, for those in South America, because that kind of pedagogy of the oppressed suggests, again, that if you are, it's like another form of supersessionism. And if you aren't, if you are a person of color who identifies in a way in which the act of colonization is deemed positive, then it poses a challenge to those who are part of a nation state that has organized. And so this is an issue, and I don't know how the church is grappling with this on a societal conversation or a religious conversation where Israel is part of the anchor for that. So it's a very good question.
Thanks for a wonderful presentation, Rachel.
Thank
and I
you.
do remember you from class.
Let's make our way down to Harvey Mines. Yeah, you're still not.
Okay, now I'm muted. I would risk consuming too much time in my question if I got to discuss details. What I want to say is that your presentation provoked in me the following thought. Jews are a historic anomaly. Toynbee couldn't understand the persistence of Jewish continuity, so he just treated us as a footnote in history, and that at some point history would resolve itself and the Jews would be gone. They just hadn't been gone yet. The fact of Jewish continuity, especially given the incredibly long period that Jewish continuity persisted apart from a geographical locus, a state or a place, was different from every other society that we became immersed in. And the various things that you talked about, which I thought was very, very well put, that is the logic and the flow and so forth, was very well presented. But there is a commonality to it, and that is every single one of these was, in the context of the time we're talking about, a political effort to use some characteristic attributed to the Jews in order to achieve a broader political objective. Generally, not always specifically, but generally as a pressure relief valve for hostility that might otherwise be focused on the then governing forces. And we were convenient because of the history of the church having to contend with the persistence of Jews after Christ. Now we are here today, and the thing that I feel that we are not doing is distinguishing between the really core political objective, which is to try to make Toynbee right, and some of the manifestations of it. We are not threatened by people who believe in space lasers any more than we are threatened by that doofus on the DC city council who thinks the Rothschilds control weather. We're not threatened by people like that. We are threatened by people who are able to inspire or to attract other people on the basis of what is the current blood libel theory. So we're beyond poisoning wells. Now what we do is assassinate innocent Palestinians. I'm overgeneralizing there, but you understand the point that I'm making. We need to fight the fight on the basis that there is a fundamental moral question, not that we have to face our own moral questions, but that Gentile society, and that includes Islam, it includes the Orientals, we have to face and persuade that they need to do some self-examination of what anti-Semitism is being used for and to oppose that. Only then will we be able to escape the phenomenon that we're now experiencing in the United States over the past 10 years. And I want to add, one of the things that caused me more heart pain than almost anything is the incredible increase in Black anti-Semitism, given the history of the American Jewish community with respect to Black freedom, Black equality, and so forth. So I've said my piece. I'd love you to comment. Thank you.
I agree with everything you said. So I'm not sure my comments are going to be so interesting. What I would say is that there are two pieces here that you're talking about. The internal Jewish conversation, I really do think has to be really a much larger conversation about particularism and universalism. And what I mean by that is that we have to be grappling with what it means to be particular as Jews and all of the literacy that requires, while recognizing that we are not meant to only be inward looking, but that we engage in a universal, and we have a mandate to engage in the universal, but that these are constantly in tension with one another. And in that conversation of particularism and universalism, I often find the younger you go, it's precisely because they're driven and animated by the universal without understanding that much of that is rooted in the particular. They do not understand it. So the desire to do good in the world, and to do good in the world only for the other, which of course we need to do, but it shouldn't be at the expense of one's own as well. And that is a much bigger educational agenda that I'm not sure who is tackling front and center at a national, international level. And Israel, just to say, is the microcosm of particularism and universalism. It actually becomes an incredible laboratory for us to be able to think about and engage with in order to explore those two poles, particularism and universal. I also say this because, and here's where it gets to a part of it, is that you have to have pride in your identity in order to be willing to stand up for your identity. And very often, other groups are able to instill that sense of pride. It's okay for African Americans and people of color to be for their own. It's okay for women to be for their own. It's okay if you're part of the LGBTQ+ to be for your own. But Jews, it's parochial if you're for your own. It's tribalistic if you're for your own. And you're called out for it. And it creates a reluctancy, a reticence to actually engage in that conversation in a serious, substantive, meaningful way. And that is a very big part of the conversation. And it also goes to part of the conversation between Black-Jewish relations and where we have not moved forward since that period of the civil rights movement, really in significant ways. It doesn't mean we abandoned the community, but we also haven't really been part of that community and discourse in the way that I think Heschel and Joachim Prinz and others would have wanted us to be part of that conversation. And yes, there is a complete flattening for the Black community of understanding Israel and the Palestinians, because there's a superimposed understanding that Palestinians are the African Americans of the Middle East. And it's quite problematic. And again, I'm saying something that is not comfortable for many people to say. And if I said this on a campus, I am telling you, I would be egged. It is not a joke. Like, I would be pushed out of that university in a heartbeat. And I am very aware of that. Also, it happens at elite high schools as well. It's not just on the campus anymore. It happens in the media and it happens in politics. So what happens on campus doesn't stay on campus. The other thing I just want to say to the last point you made, which is, how do you begin to educate the non-Jewish community about these issues? That is not a small task. And I'm going to again say something that's a little bit controversial, but if I read texts within the Hadith, right, within Islam, within the surahs of the Quran, if they haven't gone through their own reformation process the way the church has, it is highly problematic for me to come and say, hold on, here's the problem with your text. Here's the problem with your theology. You aren't being reflective and thinking about, how do you understand this now that we are living in a democracy, or now that we're in the 21st century, now that you have a more complex environment in which you are living. That has not happened within Islam. There is nothing on the horizon to tell us that it is going to happen within Islam. And I'm not saying that in a mean political way. I'm saying that in a sad, very frustrated way. It did happen within the church, which is why we can talk about the church in a much more nuanced perspective, even though there is a challenging history that goes with it. So that's part of the conversation that has to happen beyond the Jewish community, in which the Jewish community can be thought partners, should be around the table, but actually at the end of the day, will not be the ones to change that conversation.
Thank you for that answer.
Wow. I want to be respectful of your time and all of our time, but you can see you've struck a chord by the number of participants who have not only stayed with you throughout this lunch and Q&A, but are totally engaged in this topic. So I want to just say a couple of words in sum, which is that we as a community lie right here in the center. We are right in the middle, left and right. We feel that on Israel, we feel that in a lot of areas. And it really is up to us to find ways of connecting right and left, and being those bridges and finding ways to have those nuanced conversations. You have really opened up so many incredibly complex and challenging issues for us today. It really just, goes to the tip of the iceberg. But I want to say a word in sum, and a word of personal privilege about our fathers. May their memories be for a blessing, as they both passed away, I think, within just a couple of days of each other. And from what you shared with me about your father, I know how passionate he was about Zionism and Jewish peoplehood. And that was certainly, I think, a huge passion of my dad's, so much so that he insisted on us singing Am Yisrael Chai at his funeral, which I think, as everyone knows, is not traditionally part of the funeral liturgy. But I think if there's one thing that distinguishes us, it is this notion that we have this notion of being a people. And that is complicated for our young people today. And that's something that I stress, like my dad, with people who convert to Judaism, that it's not just a belief system and a series of practices, but it is, in fact, you are joining a people and a family. And that comes with good and bad, just like all families. And it's complicated. But that belief in peoplehood is one that I think lies at the very core of this entire topic. And if we're going to be able to approach this in a thoughtful way, we actually really have to start at home and build a sense of peoplehood for our own people. And I think that's what we here in our community do, both for ourselves, in our multi-generational community, for every cohort. And that really begins the process. And then if you have that, we can then hopefully be able to come at these issues from a place of being empowered and being passionate Jews, and being Jews who are proud of the story and the narrative of Jewish peoplehood throughout history. There is no story like the Jewish people throughout history. And I think it's probably one of the greatest stories in all of human history, and we should lift that up. Thank you for lifting up many issues of concern. Thank you for everyone for staying with us, and we will continue to learn and work together. Shabbat Shalom.